and author of Get Trump, The Threat to Civil Liberties, Due Process, and Our Constitutional Rule of Law, all of which are packaged in what we've just seen this week. Professor, thank you so much for being here. There's a picture of your book. Before we get into the legal details, I just want to take a quote from Rich Lowry, a very non-lawyerly quote about what we saw over this past week, and then get your reaction. He wrote, "The charges were rigged. The prosecution's presentation of the case was rigged." We just heard the president talking about that word rigged. "The judge's management of the case was rigged. The gag order was rigged. And the instructions to the jury were rigged." Is that fair?
100%. I want to say right now, I side with President Trump's assessment of the judicial system more than President Biden's assessment. I'm a liberal Democrat. I voted for Biden. Biden is dead wrong. We should not respect the legal system that is rigged. In my book, Get Trump, I predicted months before this case ever came to trial that it was a foregone conclusion there'd be a conviction. A biased judge, a biased jury, a biased prosecutor, a man who ran for office on the theory of let's find the crime to prosecute Trump for, and they couldn't find the crime, so they made it up. We're now a day after the verdict. I've known criminal law. I've been involved in criminal law 60 years. I still don't know what the crime is.
Right.
Was he found guilty of intending to violate tax laws, to violate the federal election laws, to defraud the voters? I still don't know, and we're a day after this. This is the most outrageous case. You know, everybody knows the quote from Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, and Stalin, when Beria said to Stalin,
"Show me the man and I'll show you the crime."
No, I'll find you the crime.
Find you the crime, yeah.
Tried to find the crime, and he couldn't, so he made up the crime. He took it a step further than Stalin and Lavrenti Beria. This case will go down in history as one of the most abusive prosecutions since the trial of Aaron Burr back in 18 whatever. This is a stain on our criminal justice
system. It really is. And by the way, you're not the only liberal Democrat saying that. We had this interesting piece that was in the New York Magazine, of all places, by a CNN analyst, Elie Honig. I don't know if you saw it, came out this morning. He says the charges against Trump are obscure and nearly entirely unprecedented. In fact, as you say, made up. No state prosecutor in New York or Wyoming or anywhere has ever charged federal election laws as a direct or predicate state crime against anyone for anything. None ever. So you're not the only liberal Democrat who believes that. I just wonder how many other folks out there who used to be against Trump are now in his favor.
I can tell you, I get calls, whispered calls from liberal Democrat friends of mine saying you're 100% right, but I won't say it publicly because I'm so thrilled that Trump got convicted, even though the conviction was outrageous. You get a lot of liberals who believe with Elie Honig and me that this is an unjustified conviction. We're willing to say it, but they're not willing to say it. And there's dancing on the streets, and there are people who are just, I get these emails. They're so thrilled that we violated the Constitution in order to get Trump. I have people telling me getting Trump elected is worse than undoing the Constitution. That's how extreme some of these people are. And, you know, it's not only this case, it's the three other cases. I go over each of them in my book, Get Trump. And every single one of them is based on conceptions that are in violation of the rule of law. This was the weakest case. This was the worst case. It was in a very good.
Your child needs these three key factors to get into an Ivy League or top 25 university. And
but it was in a very good jurisdiction.
But even Professor Dershowitz, did you imagine in your book or even a few weeks ago that the judge himself would bring so much of that prejudice? People are allowed to have their opinions. People are allowed to be inconsistent. But the judge is supposed to keep prejudice out of the courtroom. And his instructions to the jury, I've never seen anything like it. Somebody just called it a roadmap to conviction, which is essentially what it was. The judge is supposed to be neutral, if anything, on the side of the defense, because it's the prosecution that has to prove that something has been done illegally. But in this case, he was providing the jury with a road to conviction, was he not?
Yes. In fact, the day before the conviction, I wrote a column saying this was a directed verdict by the judge, that the judge was directing the jury to convict. And by the way, he didn't have to. The jury would have convicted anyway. Once the jury was selected from New York voters, 85% of whom don't want to see Trump as their president, the die was cast. This case should have been tried in a different county. It should have been tried in Staten Island or in Rockland County, where you get some chance of getting a fair jury. This was an unfair jury from the beginning. So the judge didn't even have to go as far as he went, but he did. And he essentially ruled in a way that made it impossible for the jury to acquit or even to hang.
Right.
I thought there would be a hung jury. But once I heard the instructions, I said, no way, you're going to get 12 jurors. I was surprised it took them 10 hours. I think maybe they just filibustered a little bit and checked off some boxes. I think they just convict this guy as soon as they went into the jury box, even before they heard the evidence.
Now, former President Trump, who, by the way, is still under this gag order, and we can talk about that, but he talked about it, but he went pretty far in testing out the limits of the gag order, where he was allowed to go, talking clearly about a couple of people that he's not allowed to mention by name, but one of whom was Michael Cohen. And the really obnoxious thing that happened, I think certainly grounds for appeal, was the prosecution saying that because Michael Cohen had a plea deal that involved election interference, that necessarily meant that Trump was guilty of election interference. The judge originally said he wasn't going to allow that suggestion to be made, but the prosecution made it, and when the defense objected to it, that objection was overruled by the judge, even though he said he was going to prevent it from happening. Here's Donald Trump talking about it this morning. Roll tape.
But the three things that he pled on, having to do with the election and having to do essentially a little bit with me, they weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA.
So again, he was convicted of things that weren't crimes.
Of course he was. Not only that, but the federal government manipulated the plea of Cohen to include Trump precisely in order to get this kind of argument that could be made. But it's pure hearsay. I mean, if Cohen thinks that Trump is guilty and pleaded guilty to a crime involving Trump, that's not relevant. So this case should easily be reversed based on the New York Court of Appeals decision in the Harvey Weinstein case. But because this guy's name is Trump, it's even worse than Harvey Weinstein in the view of judges. And so I'm not confident that it will be reversed in the New York system.
And there's also the time. There's also the timing. And forgive me, because we're running out of time. But I just want to play one soundbite from Mark Levin, who was talking, because some people are saying it's not going to, there's no way it could get to the Supreme Court before the election. He's saying we've got to kind of push it in that direction. Can you roll that Mark Levin tape, please?
Do we allow this to go by without trying to bring the matter to the steps of the Supreme Court, whether the Supreme Court takes it or not? I'm not a Nostradamus. Maybe there's a 10% chance, but the country's worth it.
So is there a way? I mean, I think back to 2000 during the election between Bush and Gore, when the Supreme Court realized this was critical to an election. I mean, this is critical to an election as well. Is it possible to persuade them to take the case before the election happens?
Yes. Mark once called me Dershowitz because my predictions have always been true about what we'll do. If the court granted review in this case, they would reverse. And I think there's a way of expediting the appeal, skipping the appellate division, going right to the Court of Appeals, ask for an expedited appeal with a decision within a month, and then take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court should take this case, should reverse the conviction, and let the voters decide who should be president without the thumb of an illegal prosecution on the scales of the election.
Professor Dershowitz, you said it all. Thank you so much, my friend. I appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful weekend.